Here is how I was neglected during my labour to the extent that I thought I was going to perish. I mean, the signs were there from day one. I read every pregnancy book you can imagine. And I used to go to these antenatal classes. I was 17 when I was pregnant with my daughter, so these antenatal classes that I would go to were especially for teenagers. There were 6 of us girls that would go to these classes. These midwives drilled into us that the chances of our babies coming before our due date was like 0%. They really made out to us that a first baby was always going to be late. So I just took their word for it. I mean, they're the experts and I'm stupid. My daughter's due date was the 22nd of August. At 6 a.m. on the 20th of August, I was awoken with back pain. This back pain felt like period pains, but in my back. But it wasn't even that bad. Like, I fell asleep half an hour after it began. But an hour later, I was awoken with the pain because it had started to get stronger. So I started to wonder if it was Braxton Hicks, if I was in false labour. It didn't even occur to me that I was in proper labour because I didn't know back contractions were a thing. It's 7:30 in the morning. I call the hospital and they put me through to the section of the maternity ward that does the birthing pool. Because I really wanted a water birth. I had that on all my pregnancy notes. I wanted to try and give birth in water. The experience sounded really nice. The midwife on the phone asked me when was the last time I'd felt my baby kick. And it had been 7 p.m. the night before. So she then said, look, I don't want to worry you. I don't want to scare you. But do you want to come in? Do you want to come in just for a scan? So obviously I was scared. I was in foster care at the time, by the way. I'd been in foster care for a couple of years, became pregnant and was still in foster care. So I knocked on my foster carer's door. She's the one who I've previously called Sandra. And I told Sandra what happened. I'd rung the hospital. I'm in all this pain. So she drove me to the hospital immediately. Our local hospital was Mayday. If you know, you know. But I'd never wanted to give birth there. So the hospital I was due to give birth in was actually out of the borough we were living in. We were living in Thornton Heath. We got to the hospital around 8:15 a.m. They saw me straight away. And of course, as soon as I lay on the bed to get a sonogram, Brooke started kicking me. But I got the scan anyway. Now, at this point, the pain in my back was not unbearable, but it was at the extent that I was trying really hard not to make noise because it was painful. So they checked my cervix to see if I was in labour, to see if I was dilated at all. And they said I wasn't. So I started crying because I want to know why I'm in so much pain and how to make it stop. And they were like, oh, your baby's probably just lying against your spine. She's probably just on the nerves. And I was like, okay, well, when does it stop? And they were like, oh, we don't know, it could be days. So all the way home, started crying. Ended up having to pull the car over because I got my morning sickness really late into pregnancy. So I had to pull over, throw up on the pavement, get back in the car and pretend it didn't happen. By lunchtime, I was on the floor, unable to hold in the sounds you make during labour. I'm not even going to attempt to impersonate these sounds. I was crying because now not only were contractions, not only were they in my back, they had spread to my front as well. So a back one would stop and then the front one would start and then that would end and then the back one would start again. My foster care rung the hospital and told them how I was feeling. And they said, no, keep her at home. She's not in labour, keep her at home. If I'd stayed at home, I would have given birth on the kitchen floor. When Sandra told me that, when Sandra said, no, they want you to stay at home, I said, take me to hospital. Take me to hospital. I don't care what they say. I don't care what they say. She drove me back to the hospital. We get there at 1 p.m. They check my cervix again. I'm 1 centimetre dilated. So they said, yes, you're in labour, but we still want you to go home. Like, it could be days. They were saying, so this was a Monday, right? There had been a girl there who had been there since Thursday. So they were like, that's probably going to be you. You probably won't give birth for days. I refused to go home. I then started to ask if I could get in the birthing pool and they said I can't because if you get in the birthing pool before you're 3 or 4 centimetres dilated, it can stop labour. So they offered me gas and air. I took one pull of it and then threw up everywhere. I did not like it. It made me feel so sick. I then asked if I could have an epidural. This is how much pain I was in, guys. I'd wrote on my notes, I don't want an epidural. I was in so much pain, I started begging for one. And they said, no, again, there's no point. Because if we give you an epidural, we're just going to have to top it up for hours and hours and hours. At one point, I went outside to sit in the air because it was a hot August day, but there was a breeze. And the breeze calmed me down. Then my family arrived, my mum and my sisters. My younger sister, bless her, my younger sister started to stroke my back to make me feel better. When you are in that much pain, you stop caring. When she started to stroke my back, I feel so bad. When she started to stroke my back, I told her to f off. Because it wasn't helping me. I felt so bad. It got to 4 p.m. I went back into the hospital. I'm terrified of elevators, right? So I started walking up the stairs and then a contraction would start, so I'd stop. And then I'd start walking up the stairs again. Then another contraction would start, so I'd stop. My contractions, I swear to God, were like less than a minute apart. Because again, back one would start, front one would start, back one would start, it kept going on. I collapsed on the floor in the hospital corridor. Some doctor ran out of nowhere with a wheelchair and like picked me up and put me in it. I then start begging this guy, please give me an epidural. Let me get in the birthing pool. They kept saying no. They said, no, you're probably only 2 or 3 centimetres dilated. And I said, well, check my cervix, please check my cervix. And they kept saying no. All the midwives I asked 3. If they had checked my cervix when I asked them to, I would have probably been about 8 centimetres. Comment for part 2. So they put me in this ward with other pregnant women, but there was a curtain drawn around me. And this man, I don't know if he was a doctor or if he was a midwife himself, he came up to me, he had like a clipboard. He was like, don't worry, it's all gonna be okay, blah, blah, blah. I'm barely listening to him because I'm in agony. I'm lying on my side, I've got my eyes closed, I'm not even looking at him. He then asked me, I think he was asking just to distract me. I think he meant well, but he asked me if this was my first pregnancy. I thought he was asking for medical reasons. So I said no. Before my daughter, I had a miscarriage. I didn't find out until my 12-week scan. So I answered, no, this isn't my first pregnancy, because I thought he was asking for medical reasons. Turns out he was asking for personal reasons, because he then said, oh, how old's your child? When I told him I had a miscarriage, he looked like he wanted to cry, to the extent that I actually almost felt bad. It was his mistake. He shouldn't have asked that if it's not for medical reasons, but he looked so disappointed in himself. I actually felt bad. Anyway, it gets to 5 p.m. and I feel like I have to push, to the extent that I can't hold it in. But I say to a midwife who was walking past, because I didn't have just one midwife. I must have spoken to like 6 different women that day. I said, I need to push. She's coming out. She's coming out. And the midwife was like, no, she's not. She's probably just on your bladder. You probably just need a wee. And I was like, well, I can't move. I'm in so much pain. I can't even stand up. I can't even lift my own head. And she was like, oh, just wet yourself. It's fine. Just wet yourself. Here's the thing. That might sound gross, but when you are in that much pain, like I said, you do not care. I pushed thinking, well, I'm just going to have to wet myself in this bed, aren't I? Something popped inside me. I thought it was my kidney. I thought I'd burst my kidneys open. Turns out it was my waters breaking. And what's even worse, I'm so glad I didn't see this. My sisters saw it. The midwife saw it. What had happened? So where I'd pushed, my daughter's head, she came down. It broke the water sac. Where the water sac broke above my daughter's head, my daughter went into shock. When babies go into shock, their whole system empties out. But she was still inside me. So now the midwives, they didn't tell me any of this until after I gave birth. But the midwives started panicking because they're now thinking my daughter could choke on her own, They wheeled me up to that delivery room so fast. Suddenly they cared. I was so out of it, right? Because bear in mind, I've been awake since 6 a.m. It's now 5:15. I've been in so much pain. I'm so exhausted. I thought they were taking me upstairs for pain relief. No one told me, you're about to give birth. Your waters have broken. They put me in a lift. I'm looking at the midwife. There's 2 of them in there. I'm looking at one of them like, are we going to give me an epidural? The way they looked at each other, I knew they weren't. I knew something was wrong, but I still didn't know what. We get out of the lift. I'm still in the bed, by the way. I'm still lying in the bed. We get out of the lift. They wheel me into a private room. They lift me up and put me onto this other bed. And I couldn't control it. I started pushing. I vaguely remember them in my ear, like saying, oh, don't push yet. Okay, push as hard as you can. Da, 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 da. I've already described in a video what the pain of labour feels like. Hands on fire, doused in lava, shoved up inside you and ripping you apart. She was born at 5:26 p.m. It was the worst day of my life. The moment I gave birth, the moment I saw my daughter, the moment I held her for the first time, that was the best moment of my life. But the day as a whole, I never want to give birth again. If I hadn't have had a labour like that, I genuinely think I would have had another child by now. But that labour, honestly, has put me off ever wanting to give birth again. I'm not going to say never, but every time I think, oh, maybe I'll have another child, I remember that day and think, no, maybe not. There is other stuff that happened after I gave birth, but that is just the neglect before. I mean, at one point, when I was having my contractions in the room with the other pregnant women, I started shouting out, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, because I genuinely thought I was going to die. And to be ignored like that, like to keep asking, please check my cervix, because I did. I asked for hours. Every hour on the hour, I would ask, please check my cervix. And if they had, I would have got that pain relief. If I'd stayed at home, could you imagine if I'd stayed at home? Like I said, I would have given birth on the kitchen. Ugh.